Last time, Sarah Briggs arrived in Millhaven with nothing but a carpet bag and $4, rescued from a blizzard by rancher Jack Callahan. She proved her strength, won his heart, and together they exposed the man who'd stolen her family's land. They married in the spring. Tonight, 6 months later, peace is about to be tested. If you're just joining us, welcome. And if you watched episode 1, hit subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of Sarah and Jack's story. Let's get into episode 2. The kitchen at Callahan Ranch smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, and Sarah Callahan, she still caught herself smiling at the sound of that name, 6 months married and it hadn't worn off yet, was elbow deep in biscuit dough when Marta came through the back door stamping mud off her boots. 8 men at that table in 20 minutes, Marta announced. And Hector's already complaining there's no gravy. There's always gravy, Marta. Hector complains on principle. That he does. Marta dropped a basket of eggs on the counter and gave Sarah a sideways look, the kind she'd been giving her more often lately. You're humming again. Am I? Every morning this week, newlywed humming, I remember it. Marta's voice softened, just slightly, the way it did when she let herself remember things she didn't usually talk about. Don't let it stop on my account. Sarah laughed and kept working the dough. Through the window, she could see Jack out by the corral, coatless despite the morning chill, running a hand down the foreleg of a young mare that had pulled up lame the week before. He had that particular stillness about him he got around an animal in pain, patient, unhurried, the same way he'd been with Sarah herself the night he found her in the snow. He's been out there since before sunup, Marta said, following her gaze, worried about that horse. He worries about everything out here like it's family, Sarah said, including me most days. Including you most of all, Marta said, and went back to cracking eggs before Sarah could decide whether to argue the point. The back door banged open again, this time admitting Hector, hat already off, hair flattened with sweat despite the cold. Morning, Mrs. Callahan. He said it the same way every morning, a little formally, a little fondly, like he still got a small private satisfaction out of the title. Boss wants to know if breakfast's close. We got the south fence to mend before that rain comes in. 5 minutes, Sarah said. Tell him if he comes in with mud on my floor again, he can eat standing up in the yard. Hector grinned. I'll tell him. Won't do a lick of good, but I'll tell him. He left, whistling something tuneless, and Sarah found herself laughing again at nothing in particular. Just the easy, ordinary rhythm of a morning that, 6 months ago, she wouldn't have believed she'd ever get to have. A kitchen of her own, a husband who worried over lame horses with the same care he'd once shown a half-frozen stranger, a house full of people who said her name like she belonged in it. She didn't know yet that the rhythm was about to break. Breakfast was loud, the way it always was with 8 ranch hands at one table, and Sarah had learned to love the noise of it, the arguments about cattle prices, Hector's terrible jokes, the easy way Jack presided over all of it without ever needing to raise his voice. It was near the end of the meal when young Daniel Webb, the newest hand, came in late, holding an envelope like it might bite him. Beggin' pardon, Mrs. Callahan. Postmaster gave me this for Mr. Callahan when I picked up the feed order. Said it comes special, government stamp on it. The table went a little quieter. Government mail wasn't usually good news for a rancher, and everyone at that table knew it. Jack took the envelope, turned it over once, and Sarah watched something flicker across his face before he even opened it. The particular wariness of a man who'd learned, over 14 years of running a ranch, that official letters rarely brought anything but trouble. He slid it open with his knife and read in silence while the table waited. Jack? Sarah said finally. He set the letter down slowly. It's from the Territorial Land Office. Continental Western Railroad has filed a new survey request. He looked up and his eyes found Sarah's first, like he already knew this would land harder on her than anyone else at the table. They're proposing a new northern route. Says here the preliminary survey shows it crossing the north section of Callahan land, same section as the old homestead house. He paused. Same section as Clara's grave. Nobody said anything for a moment. Even Hector, never short on commentary, kept his mouth shut. Sarah felt something cold settle low in her stomach, not for herself this time, but for the man across the table whose jaw had gone tight in a way she'd only seen once before, the night Hector told them about Franklin Gould's railroad scheme back in Nebraska. Continental Western, she said carefully. Jack, isn't that the same company Gould was working with? The one that bought the right-of-way on my father's land? Jack didn't answer right away. He was looking at the letter like it might rearrange itself into something less unwelcome if he looked hard enough. It's the same company, he said finally. Doesn't mean it's the same man behind it. Could be coincidence. Railroads expand, surveys get filed. This is just how the business works. Could be, Hector said slowly from the end of the table. Or could be a man who lost once decides there's more than one way to take a piece of land he wants. Jack folded the letter and set it beside his plate, and Sarah watched him visibly decide not to let the table see how much it had rattled him. Either way, he said, a survey request isn't a seizure. It's a long way from one. We'll find out what's actually being proposed before anybody starts losing sleep over it. He looked around the table, voice steady again, Foreman Jack instead of worried husband Jack. South fence still needs mending. Let's get to it. The men filed out. Sarah stayed at the table, and when the kitchen had emptied, she reached over and put her hand over his. You don't have to do the steady and calm thing with me, she said. Not at this table. I've seen what worry looks like on you. I'd rather you let me see it than pretend it isn't there. Jack was quiet for a moment, looking down at her hand on his. Clara's buried on that ridge, he said finally, voice lower now that it was just the two of them. I picked that spot myself. Faces east, catches the first light every morning. I used to ride up there most Sundays just to sit a while. He exhaled slowly. The idea of a survey crew running stakes through it. I don't much like it, Sarah. I won't pretend I do. I know, she said softly. And if it really is connected to Gould somehow, then we'll handle it the same way we handled the last one, Jack said, some of the steel coming back into his voice. Together, with our eyes open this time instead of getting caught flat-footed. She nodded, though something in her chest stayed uneasy. She knew Franklin Gould. She knew that men who lost once rarely walked away quietly. They simply waited and found a different door. That afternoon, before her trip into town, Sarah found Jack up on the North Ridge, exactly where she'd guessed he'd be. He was sitting on the flat stone near Clara's marker, hat off, turning it slowly in his hands the way he did when something was sitting heavy on him that he hadn't yet found words for. Sarah approached slowly, giving him the chance to wave her off if he wanted solitude instead, but he looked up and made room beside him on the stone without a word, which was its own kind of invitation. I don't come up here as often as I used to, he admitted once she'd settled beside him. Used to be every Sunday. Now it's maybe once a month, if that. Marta thinks that means I've healed. I think it just means I found something else worth spending my Sundays on. He glanced sideways at her, the smallest smile pulling at his mouth. No offense intended to Clara's memory by saying that. I don't think she'd take offense, Sarah said. From everything you've told me about her, I think she'd want exactly that for you. She would have liked you, Jack said quietly. That's a strange thing to say to your second wife, I expect. But I think it's true. She didn't suffer fools, and she had no patience at all for people who complained about hard work instead of just doing it. You'd have gotten along. Sarah looked out over the valley spread below the ridge, the ranch house, the barn, the corral where the lame mare was still favoring her foreleg, the long fence lines Jack and his men had built and mended 100 times over. From up here you could see almost the whole of Callahan land, green and gold under the afternoon sun, and it was easy to understand why a man would choose this particular spot to bury the person he loved most. Is this why the survey frightens you more than the land office letter lets on? She asked gently. Not just because it's your land, because it's this piece of it. Jack was quiet for a long moment. When Clara died, I had this land and nothing else that felt like it mattered. I built every fence and every barn afterward, half out of grief and half out of not knowing what else to do with myself. This ridge is the one place on the whole 2,000 acres I never once thought about in terms of profit or grazing rights or anything practical at all. It's just hers. He turned the hat over once more in his hands. The idea of some surveyor from Omaha walking up here with a transit and a notebook, treating it like any other parcel of dirt to be measured and priced, it does something to me I don't entirely have words for, Sarah. I'm not proud of how much it does. You don't need to be proud of it, she said. You just need to let me carry some of it with you, instead of sitting up here working through it alone. He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his face. I'm not used to that yet, he admitted. 14 years of handling things myself, old habit. Then we'll just have to break it, Sarah said, one ridge at a time. He laughed, low and surprised, and reached over to take her hand the way he had at the breakfast table, except this time there was no letter on the table between them, no audience of ranch hands, just the wind moving over the grass and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, he wasn't going to face it the way he'd faced the last 4 years, alone. I should let you get into town before the light goes, he said eventually, though he didn't let go of her hand right away. Get what Marta needs from the store. I'll see about sending that telegram to Reeves first thing tomorrow. I'll be back before supper, Sarah promised. She didn't know yet, riding down off that ridge toward town, that the conversation she was about to have with Franklin Gould on the Millhaven boardwalk would make the survey letter feel, in hindsight, like the smallest part of the trouble headed their way. By the time Sarah rode into Millhaven that Saturday for supplies, the news of the railroad survey had already beaten her there. Small towns moved information faster than any telegraph line, and the general store was practically vibrating with opinions on the matter. Heard the railroad wants to run right through the Callahan place, said old Mr. Tate, the store's proprietor, ringing up a sack of flour for another customer while Sarah waited her turn. My nephew works the section gang out of Cheyenne, says Continental Western's been buying up survey rights all along this stretch of territory for 2 years now. Big money behind it. Any word on who exactly is behind the company? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice light. Eastern investors mostly, though. Tate lowered his voice, leaning across the counter the way he did whenever he had something he considered particularly choice. Word is one of the principal investors is a fella out of Omaha, name of Gould. Now, I don't know if that's the same Gould folks talk about regarding your business last year, Mrs. Callahan, but it does seem an awful coincidence, don't it? Sarah felt her stomach drop, though she kept her face composed. It does seem a coincidence, Mr. Tate. Thank you. She was carrying her first sack of flour out to the wagon when Mrs. Pruitt, the Reverend's wife, caught her arm with the particular urgency of a woman who had something she considered important to share. Mrs. Callahan, a moment, if you please. Mrs. Pruitt glanced both ways down the street before lowering her voice. I don't like to gossip, you understand, but I think you ought to know. There's been 3 other ranches besides yours that got letters from the land office this month. The Hendricks place, the Walsh spread out past the river, even old Mr. Calloway's smaller parcel, and that man doesn't own enough land to interest a railroad in the ordinary course of things. 3 other ranches, Sarah repeated slowly. Did they all get the same kind of letter? About the survey? That's what I hear. My husband visited with Mr. Hendricks just yesterday. The man's beside himself, says he's farmed that land 30 years, and now some company out of Omaha thinks it can run a railroad straight through his wheat fields without so much as a by your leave. Mrs. Pruitt shook her head. It does seem an awful lot of coincidence, doesn't it? All these letters arriving the same month, right after that Gould fellow turns up in town again? It does seem like a great deal of coincidence, Sarah agreed, her mind already racing ahead to what this might mean. Not one rancher being targeted, but an entire valley's worth of land quietly being maneuvered into position, one quiet legal filing at a time. Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Pruitt. I mean that. Well, somebody ought to be looking out for one another out here, Mrs. Pruitt said. Lord knows the railroad men aren't going to do it for us. She was loading her wagon outside, turning Mrs. Pruitt's words over in her mind, when a voice behind her made her go very still. Mrs. Callahan, it is Mrs. Callahan now, isn't it? I did hear about the wedding. Belated congratulations. She turned. Franklin Gould stood on the boardwalk in a new suit, looking exactly as composed and unbothered as he had the day he'd called her a fraud in the Millhaven saloon, exactly as he'd looked the day she'd lost the only home she'd ever known. "Mr. Gould?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I wasn't aware you were back in the territory." "Business," he said, smiling in the way that had never once reached his eyes. "I find Wyoming has become rather interesting to a certain kind of investor lately. Railroads, land values, the sort of thing that rewards patience." He glanced toward her wagon, loaded with supplies for the Callahan Ranch, and something in his expression sharpened. "I understand your husband received an interesting letter from the land office this week. You'll have to ask him about his correspondence." "Oh, I don't need to ask," Gould said pleasantly. "I'm aware of the contents. I sit on the board that approved the survey filing." He stepped a little closer, lowering his voice, though the street was busy enough that no one else seemed to be paying attention. "You should know, Mrs. Callahan, I bear you no particular ill will. Business is business. I lost a legal challenge last year fairly, and I've made my peace with that loss. But land has a way of finding its true value eventually, no matter how many courtrooms try to argue otherwise. I'd hate for your husband to learn that the hard way, the way your father did." Sarah felt heat rise in her chest, sharp and immediate. "My father's land was stolen from him through fraud, Mr. Gould. A court agreed with that finding. I'd be careful how you tell that story." "I'd be careful," Gould said, voice still maddeningly pleasant. "How confident you are that history doesn't repeat itself. Good day, Mrs. Callahan. Give my regards to your husband." He turned to go, then paused, as if a thought had only just occurred to him, though Sarah suspected nothing Franklin Gould said was ever quite that spontaneous. "One more thing," he said, half turning back. "I understand the survey route under consideration runs near a small family plot on the Callahan land. A grave, I believe. I want you to know, purely as a professional courtesy, that should the final route require it, the company is prepared to be quite generous about relocation costs. We are not unreasonable people, Mrs. Callahan, whatever you may have come to believe about me." Sarah felt something colder than anger move through her, a kind of disbelief that a man could speak so casually about digging up the dead and call it a courtesy. "You'd move her grave," Sarah said quietly, "to lay track. If it comes to that, yes. Land has its purposes, Mrs. Callahan, and sentiment, however understandable, rarely changes a certain." She told him everything that evening, on the porch, after the ranch had gone quiet for the night. Jack listened without interrupting, the way he always did, though she could see the muscle working in his jaw by the time she finished. "He's behind the survey," Jack said. It wasn't a question. He as much as admitted it, said he sits on the board. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "Jack, he didn't sound like a man who'd given up. He sounded like a man playing a longer game than I understood the first time." Jack was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the North Ridge against the stars, the ridge where Clara was buried, the ridge a survey crew might soon be staking out with government authority behind them. "Last time," he said slowly, "he came after your land because he saw an opportunity and your father wasn't there to stop him. This time he's coming after mine, and he knows exactly what kind of fight he's picking. That should worry him more than it worries us. Or it should worry us that a man with that much money and that much patience doesn't pick fights he doesn't think he can win." Jack turned to look at her, and in the lamplight from the window she could see something steady settle into his expression. Not the worry from breakfast, but something more resolved. "Then we make sure he's wrong," he said. "We did it once already, Sarah. We'll do it again, and this time we won't wait for him to make the first move." "What did you have in mind?" "First thing tomorrow," Jack said. "I'm sending word to Arthur Reeves. If Gould's involved in this survey, I want to know exactly how, and I want to know it before that survey crew sets one stake in the ground." He paused. "Second thing, I want to talk to every rancher between here and the county line whose land might fall inside that proposed route. If Continental Western thinks it's dealing with one stubborn rancher and his wife, it's about to find out it's dealing with an entire valley." Sarah felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, at the certainty in his voice. Not because the danger was gone, but because she wasn't facing it alone this time, the way she'd faced everything alone for so long before that snowstorm changed her life. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I haven't told you yet because I wasn't sure how to say it." Jack went still. "What is it?" "When my father died and Gould first approached me about the debt, there was something in one of his letters I never made sense of. A reference to prior arrangements regarding railroad right-of-way assessments. At the time, I thought it was just legal language, but now, hearing him talk today about land finding its true value eventually, Jack, I think this has never just been about my father's land or about your ranch. I think Gould has been building something much bigger for years, and we've only ever seen the small pieces of it." Jack reached over and took her hand, the way he had that morning at the breakfast table, except this time there was nothing steady and calm about it. Just two people, side by side, looking at a problem too large to see the edges of yet. "Then we'd better find out how big it really is," he said, "before it finds the rest of us first." From down the road, faint in the evening quiet, came the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Too fast for a casual visit, too late in the evening for good news. Jack stood, one hand instinctively going to Sarah's shoulder, positioning himself slightly in front of her the way he had on Main Street the night they met. The rider came into the lamplight a moment later and Sarah recognized him immediately. Daniel Webb, the young hand who'd brought the letter that morning, hatless now, breathing hard like he'd ridden the whole way from town without stopping once. "Mr. Callahan," he called out, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "Mr. Callahan, you need to come into town right now." "What's happened?" Jack's voice had gone hard, form and flat. "It's the old Hendricks place," Daniel said, still catching his breath. "Survey crew showed up there this afternoon, ahead of schedule with papers from the county. Hendricks tried to run him off his land and there was a confrontation, Mr. Callahan. Shots fired. Nobody's dead, but old man Hendricks is hurt bad, and the marshal's asking for you by name. Says you're the only rancher in the valley Gould's people might actually listen to." "How bad is he hurt?" Sarah asked, stepping forward. "Took a fall trying to get between the surveyors and his own fence line, far as anyone can tell. Doc says it's his hip, and at his age that's no small thing." Daniel shook his head, still winded. "Marshall's got the survey crew held up at the jailhouse for their own protection, near as I can tell. Half the valley showed up once word got round, and tempers are running about as hot as I've ever seen 'em in this town." "Did anyone see who gave the order to start surveying ahead of the filing date?" Jack asked. "Because if Continental Western jumped the gun on their own paperwork, that's a violation we can use." "Marshall's asking the same thing. Crew foreman says he was just following instructions from the company office. Wouldn't say whose instructions exactly." Daniel glanced between them. "There's also a fella in a fine suit standing around the jailhouse making sure everybody knows he's a company man. Older fella, gray at the temples. Folks are saying his name's Gould." Sarah's breath caught. "He's there, right now." "Was when I left to ride out here," Daniel confirmed. Sarah felt the cold from the evening air sink straight through to her bones. Jack looked at her once, a long look full of everything they hadn't yet had time to say, then turned back to Daniel. "Saddle my horse," he said. "I'm coming now." "I'm coming with you," Sarah said immediately. Jack hesitated. "Sarah, it's dark. There's already been shots fired once tonight, and I don't know what's waiting for us in that town." "Which is exactly why I'm not staying here wondering about it," Sarah said, already moving toward the barn. "Jack, that man stood on Main Street this afternoon and told me, calm as you like, that he'd dig up Clara's grave if the economics made sense. I am done letting Franklin Gould do his business in rooms I'm not standing in." Something passed across Jack's face. Worry, certainly, but underneath it something that looked almost like pride. "All right," he said. "But you stay close, and the second I tell you to get clear of something, you get clear of it. Agreed?" "Agreed." They rode for town together under a sky gone fully dark, the lights of Millhaven glowing faint on the horizon ahead, neither of them speaking, both of them braced for whatever was waiting in that jailhouse, an injured old man, an angry valley, and Franklin Gould standing in the middle of it all, exactly where he wanted to be. "Oh, Mr. Callahan, one more matter while I have you." Gould's voice dropped slightly, pitched for the two of them alone. "In researching the original Callahan land grant in preparation for the survey filing, my associates came across something rather curious in the territorial archives. A discrepancy in the original boundary description from 1861 regarding the northern section of your property, the very section, as it happens, where your late wife is buried." He let that sit a moment, watching Jack's face carefully. "I'm sure it's nothing. Old surveys are notoriously imprecise, but I thought as a courtesy you'd want to know such a question exists before the matter potentially becomes a more formal one." The street noise seemed to fade around them. Sarah felt Jack go very still beside her. "What kind of discrepancy?" Jack said. His voice had gone flat in a way Sarah had never heard before. The kind that, depending on how a court chose to interpret it, might mean the northern boundary of your land was never quite where your uncle's original deed claimed it to be. Gould smiled, faint and unhurried. "I wouldn't trouble yourself over it tonight, Mr. Callahan. These things take months to sort through properly, years sometimes. Good evening to you both." He walked away into the dark, and this time neither Jack nor Sarah moved to stop him, both of them too stunned by what he'd just said to do anything but watch him go. "Jack!" Sarah turned to him, searching his face. "What does that mean? The boundary?" "It means," Jack said slowly, the words coming out like they cost him something, "that if there's any truth to what he just said, the ridge where Clara's buried might not even be Callahan land at all." He looked toward the dark shape of the hills beyond town, toward home, toward the ridge he'd ridden up to nearly every Sunday for 4 years. It might never have been mine to begin with. Just when Sarah and Jack thought they understood what they were fighting, Franklin Gould reveals there's a far older secret buried in that land than either of them ever imagined, and it's about to change everything. Hit subscribe so you're here for episode 3, where we dig into the truth about the original Callahan land grant and what it could mean for Jack's entire ranch. Drop a comment. Do you think Gould is telling the truth, or is this just another move in his game? I'll see you in the next episode.